Wonder Woman 1984 is, of course, the latest film from DC and Warner Brothers, and the sequel to the 2017 Wonder Woman film. The sequel has a new team of writers of Patty Jenkins, who also directs, Jeff Johns, and Dave Callaham, as the film takes the titular character into the world of the 80s. The reason I note the writers is because it's one particular decision that they make in the story that I'll be discussing here, and it revolves around consent in a world of magic and superpowers. I should say right now that there'll be spoilers for a lot of the film. Now, I don't feel like I can talk about this film and not talk about the fact that it seems to have divided audiences, and aggressively so in some cases. Some people love it and others hate it. Personally, I have conflicted feelings overall. There's stuff I definitely enjoyed, particularly the fact that it was a more personal film rather than a large-scale one, despite a bit of international travel. But there's also stuff that I really didn't like, including how some of the fight scenes were shot. I will say though, objectively, it isn't a bad film. It may not be particularly great from a technical standpoint, but it certainly isn't badly made. Subjectively, it's a film that will either give people what they want or won't, which is like a lot of films. But this video is not about whether the film is good or not, but instead it's a discussion about how consent plays into the story. With that noted, let's talk about the film. The plot of the film, or at least specifically the plot that leads into the issues of consent I'm going to talk about today, revolves around a magical rock that can grant a single wish to any person who holds it. Diana, not realizing it's real at the time, accidentally wishes for her love Steve Trevor to come back to life, after he sacrificed himself in the first film. Barbara Minerva wishes to be like Diana, and ends up gaining not only her confidence, but also her powers. And Maxwell Lord wishes to have the powers of the stone and grant people wishes for his own gain. So Diana has wished Steve back to life, although she doesn't know it at first, and the audience isn't explicitly told that this happens because she does so in a thought. She discovers that he's alive again at an event where he tracks her down, only she doesn't realize it's him at first as he's in the body of another man. This is where things start to get real iffy, and that's to put it lightly. After that, he takes her back to his apartment, which is where it is fully revealed that he has taken over another man's body and also his life entirely. The pair then end up having sex, with Steve still in this other man's body, before they drag that body through all kinds of dangerous situations. I'm sure there are plenty of people who wouldn't give any of this a second thought. It is a film about magic after all, and that usually brings along a lot of crazy ideas. But the way media talks about certain things and how we react to that can say a lot about us both as individuals and as a society on the whole. How we react to consent in a film says a lot about the kinds of attitudes that we foster within our own society. But let's quickly talk about what consent is. The definition of consent according to Merriam-Webster is to give assent or approval. More specifically on sexual consent, Rain says, consent is an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. Consent should be clearly and freely communicated. A verbal and affirmative expression of consent can help both you and your partner to understand and respect each other's boundaries. Consent cannot be given by individuals who are underage, intoxicated or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep or unconscious. If someone agrees to an activity under pressure of intimidation or threat, that isn't considered consent because it was not given freely. Unequal power dynamics, such as engaging in sexual activity with an employee or student, also mean that consent cannot be freely given. Essentially, a person gives approval for a particular action to take place or not take place as they choose. In common thought, it usually revolves around a person's physical body, most notably sexual intercourse. Except in specific circumstances, such as life-saving medical care for a person who is unresponsive, if a person is unable to give consent freely, the act undertaken will most often become illegal. So how does consent play into Wonder Woman 1984? This film removes agency from a character, and therefore their consent. The man is completely removed from his own body and life so Steve can inhabit it, and every action that occurs after Steve's return is done so without his express consent. When Diana and Steve have sex, it is using that man's body, a man who cannot consent to the sexual act. That's rape. But is this matter made more complicated by the inclusion of magic? Not really. The man's body is still being used without his consent. For all intents and purposes, he is unconscious. His body has been hijacked. Now, this could have made for a really good discussion point within the film. The characters could have dealt with the fact that the man had had his consent taken away by magic just so Steve could live again. Steve's return is a point of conflict within the film and drives a good chunk of the drama. Diana wants Steve to stay, but it's revealed that him doing so may destroy everything. So she does eventually renounce her wish and banish Steve back to death, but the fact he had possessed another man's body is never a part of that equation. The fact that he's in another man's body is only really brought up 2 or 3 times throughout the film, largely right after the reveal, and never really talked about in a "this is wrong" kind of way. A lot of the time it's actually played for laughs. It isn't at all helped by the fact that after the reveal we are only really shown Chris Pine's Steve. We never see the other man again until right at the very end after Steve is dead once more. Going back and forth between seeing Steve and the other man he has possessed would have at least helped keep the situation at the forefront of the audience's minds as the film continued, which would have at least been something more than how the film did actually handle it. The fact that the characters don't ever really acknowledge the situation or the issues it brings up means that the film never discusses it. It is simply this strange thing that exists within the narrative for no real reason. It doesn't add to the drama of the story or have any impact upon the characters or their actions. The most it adds are a few jokes, and almost all of them could have still existed with a different scenario. It is essentially fluff within the film, except that this fluff involves the removal of consent. The simplest solution would have been to just not do Steve's return in that manner. If him being in another man's body adds nothing, then simply having him return as himself would have worked just as well. In fact, just having him return would have been the simplest solution within the narrative. Possessing another body is just extra steps. It's the kind of idea you may explore while building the story, but you should cut once you realize it adds nothing. Now, one of the key arguments I have seen for why it happens this way is because it's magic. The stone did it that way. Firstly, I'll say that this isn't actually an answer. The stone does whatever the writers decide it does, so if it causes a character to lose consent, then that is a choice they made, not the stone. But exploring that point does bring up another issue, the vagueness of magic within the story. Magic can be vague and work fine, but when you add limits to it, you need to stick by your own rules. The film tells us a few certain things about the wish stone. Firstly, it can only grant 1 wish per person, no multiple uses. Secondly, that it is a monkey paw situation where a wish will cost you what you love most. That's me paraphrasing a little bit. Also, if the wishes are not renounced or the stone destroyed, then the stone will eventually cause the collapse of the civilization it is in. Within the film, Lord then wishes for the powers of the stone to be his, so he is able to grant a single wish to any person, and then on top of that he can take something from them. That last point is something never really explained since the wish still has the monkey paw element to it, so Lord taking something else is a new rule added just for him. People point out that the possession could be part of the monkey paw side of the stone, except that doesn't really make sense with the rules that are given. What is taken is meant to be something that the person loves. Diana neither knew the man prior, nor is it something taken from her. The man had nothing to do with her wish. We could argue that Diana would care about the man's loss of consent, except that isn't explored within the text of the film itself, so it's something we'd be adding from outside. But there's also the fact that she shows she doesn't care when she has sex with that man's body. More importantly though, Diana already has her monkey paw curse pointed out by the film directly. She's gradually losing her powers. She ultimately only renounces her wish both because it is needed to save civilization, and it is also decided that she needs her powers. As I said earlier, the man who's been possessed is never a part of that equation. So why was the possession kept in despite the film not actually utilizing it? I can't say. I'm not one of the writers, and so unless they say openly, I cannot know their intent. I can only assume that there was one, and either the payoff was cut from the film, or they felt like they did whatever they wanted to do with it. Either way, it is still something that should have been questioned more during the entire process. People should have asked why it was there and if it needed to be. This issue may not ruin the film, and there are certainly people who won't even notice it, but it is still this strange stain upon the story. A choice that calls so much into question and didn't have to be there to begin with. There's plenty of things within this film that are questionable at best, but most of them I am far less qualified to talk about. I just have to question why the writers decided this particular thing needed to be included when it adds nothing and makes it so easy to question Diana's morality. To me, the characters should have cared more about it, tried to find a way to get Steve his own body, but they didn't. They just moved along because the film had other places to be. Though, in all honesty, including some lack of consent without ever discussing it makes it very much like a film from the 80s.
Life is good, but it can be better.
Oh my god.